Well, in 2003, I found a lump on my leg, and it had to be removed. It got fairly large, and there were some concerns. The biopsy showed that it was benign, but after it was removed, it showed some cancer activity in there, but the margins were clear. And I basically was told to go out and live the rest of my life, that I got a good seal of health, and that I should get it tested once a year just to make sure that I remain cancer-free, which I did. But unfortunately, 3 years later, I found out that it metastasized to both of my lungs. So that first 3 years, I didn't think much of it. I had the surgery and I got through it. But finding out that it would metastasize to both my lungs and that it was inoperable, matter of fact, that there were too many nodules to operate on the lungs, was pretty scary, as you can imagine. And it was also very, very depressing. I had some lung biopsies done to confirm their diagnosis, and I was told that I needed to see an oncologist, and I made my appointment with an oncologist in the city, and I was put on a clinical trial because there really wasn't much more they could do. The cancer that I have is extremely rare, so very few people get it, and the prognosis isn't the best for people who do get it. So we chose this clinical trial route. And the clinical trial actually worked for a while. And it turned out that on the clinical trial, I was one of 2 people that had some positive results. But the side effects became overbearing. My skin was literally burning off of my body. And they had to cut it back until they stabilized the chemo side effects. But when they got so far back where the chemo side effects were stabilized, it was no longer helping the cancer. And my cancer started to grow and grow and grow. So eventually they took me off the clinical trial, put me on another chemo, which failed to work. So there was one more drug that they could try. And my first treatment of that drug, I had a severe reaction. I had an anaphylactic response, and I wasn't breathing right, my heart wasn't beating right. It turned out that I was allergic to the chemo. But the decision was to push through it, and they pumped me up with steroids and antihistamines and anti-nausea drugs, and gave me the drug anyway. Well, unfortunately, about 3 days later, it was at a rock concert in Giant Stadium, where I started to get some uncomfortable pains in my stomach. And by the next day, I had 104 fever. I was dehydrated. My wife was concerned about the way I was acting, so I was rushed to the hospital. And they asked me, the typical emergency room questions. I barely remember my name. My wife was so upset that she barely remembered my name. But at the time, because I was involved in a lot of what's called medical quality improvement, I had all my health records organized on this portable flash drive in my wallet. And my wife remembered that I had it. She gave it to the doctors and the nurses, and they came back and said, "You just saved your husband's life," because we were going to give him an antibiotic that he was allergic to. By the way, am I talking to the camera or to him? Does it matter? They then put me on antibiotics. I was in the hospital for 2.5 months without being able to break the fever. It was the second time since my diagnosis where they basically said that they weren't sure I was going to pull through. When I was first diagnosed, they said 6 months to 2 years maybe. When I went into the hospital, they told my wife that I may never come out of the hospital. I ruptured my appendix as a result of this reaction to the drug. And I had a collapsed lung, and I had 2 abscesses in my abdomen that if they burst, they alone would have killed me. Because I had appendicitis, normally procedure is surgery, but they couldn't operate because of the abscess. So I was really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So they bombarded me with these antibiotics. Believe it or not, I lost 60 pounds over that 2-month period in the hospital. But one of the things I promised myself, that if I got out of the hospital, I was going to make that flash drive that saved my life available to consumers directly to save more lives. And we did. I got my company to back it. We developed this product that now is distributed throughout the world to allow other people to keep track of their health records. And to this day, we get letters all the time saying, thank you so much. This product has saved a family member's life or their own life, and it's a very rewarding experience. And the decision at that time was also to take me off of that chemo that almost killed me. But I was only on it for one treatment, and I consulted some other second opinions, and the recommendation was that I give it another couple of months. During the time in the hospital, there was no shrinkage, but a lot of symptoms related to the chemo itself. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to take me off. But my own research indicated that I wasn't on it long enough to know whether the drug itself would help. So the decision was made, let's try it again, after I healed a bit from that experience. And my next CAT scan surprised everybody. There was reduction. So the decision was to keep me on that drug, and I remained on that drug for over 5 years. And during that time period, I got 95% reduction in my disease. So when I look back, I try to figure out, what was I doing? Because like my doctor said, I was the kind of patient that my doctor always dreamed about having, because I wasn't giving in to the disease, and I was fighting the disease, and the drug was working, and he was doing his job, so everybody was happy. But one of the things I decided to do after my experience with the hospital stay is not only computerize these health records in this company, but also to create the stereotypical bucket list, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And I started putting things in the bucket list that were really designed to help people who were in dilemmas. It could have been medical, not necessarily medical. It could have been, family disputes or financial disputes. And I found that the more I did that and helped people resolve these problems, the better I felt. And it took me a while, because you don't come out of the hospital and say, okay, from now on, I'm going to think positive. But after a while, you realize that I've been thinking positive, and I've been doing positive things with my bucket list, with my family, looking to build memories, kind of taking one day at a time, but still during the process, focusing on positive thinking. And some of it's difficult, because when you have a diagnosis of cancer, you think about having cancer every single day of your life. There's not a day that I don't wake up and say, I have cancer. I do a body check. How do I feel today? Well, I feel pretty good, so I'm going to go through the day and push forward. In order to remain positive, I had to minimize the thought process about having cancer. And there were some interesting things that, for me personally, took place. One is, I don't like people to ask me how you feel or tell me that you look good, because as soon as they do that, I focus on what they're talking about. So if I have a pain, I'm gonna do, how do you feel? Well, I'm gonna think about it. Oh yes, I have this pain that's been bothering me, or I'm getting cramps that's been bothering me. So I've kind of politely trained my surroundings not to ask me these questions, because I found that taking my mind off it and looking at things that I could be productive with, or helping resolve issues that are on my bucket list, work for me. They make me feel better. I've been on this chemo for 5 years, and a year ago or so, actually it was early September, 2 days before my treatment for chemo, I get this phone call to tell me that the chemo that I've been on for 5 years is no longer available to me. 2 days notice, basically they were giving me a death sentence because that is what was keeping me alive for that amount of time. It was like getting diagnosed with cancer all over again. I had to start from scratch with this process. And my first reaction was depression, just as if I originally got diagnosed. But I remembered that how I got out of the depression. And believe it or not, those stages that you hear people talk about when they have a tragedy in their life, first comes depression, then comes denial, then comes anger, and then comes acceptance, right? You know, why me? It's not me. And then, okay, it's me now. What am I going to do about it? Those phases really take place. But for me, it became extremely important to get through them quickly as possible. So if I got to the acceptance stage once and I pushed forward, I could get to the acceptance stage again. And I began to advocate for myself and try to find my next dosage of drugs. And in order to do that, I had to go into what's commonly referred to as the gray market, because the normal markets were no longer available to me. And I managed to do that for a number of treatments with the help of contacts, with the help of networking myself through people who may know people. I have had direct contact with the drug manufacturer. I researched the reasons for the drug shortage. And I ended up getting a lot of publicity out of it, too much publicity, to the point where they put this very unflattering picture of me on the front page of the newspaper that ran national, hooked up to the chemo tubes and half passed out on a chair. But it got a lot of people's attention. And I was then asked to lobby in Washington, D.C. about drug shortage. So I sort of went from being an advocate to being an activist. And I still consider myself an activist because these kind of things should not be taking place in this country. Now, these articles ran about a year ago, but to this day, I still get phone calls from people who are familiar with the article and call me up for help. Sometimes just emotional support, and sometimes, you know, what did I do to get my drug? Can I help them to get their medication? I had to fight my way through all of this stuff, and I did. But I also learned more about my disease and more about the chemo. And one of the things that I learned, that I was one of a few, if not the only one, that has ever been on this drug for as long as I've been on it. And there was doubt on whether or not the drug even had the ability or capability to work that long. So there was an investigation to determine, you know, did my immune system take over miraculously somehow, or is this drug still working? And the problem was that the drugs eventually, my doctor said, eventually something's going to give if I stay on this medication. I can't stay on it possibly that long. I had severe neuropathy in my legs. I could barely walk. I had some skin conditions as a result of this, severe fatigue. So a decision was made to look at whether or not the drug was working. And unfortunately, that investigation turned out to be inconclusive. There wasn't enough information to determine it without some major surgery, and that itself had its own risks. So very recently, a decision was made to take me off of the medication to see what happens. And that was in June of this past year. And 6 weeks later, I was due for my next dosage. And it was the strangest thing in the world, because even though I didn't have the dose, my body went through the same symptoms as if I did. In other words, I was going through some kind of withdrawal. Yeah. And on top of that, I developed a severe irregular heartbeat. So I had to push myself through it. I was looking forward to skipping the dosage, but unfortunately skipping the dosage had its own consequences. September, I was tested off the drug for the first time that long, and the results came back that I was stable. And there are very few answers to explain why I'm stable. There is still some confusion of whether or not the drug was working or is still working or still in my system. But they now have decided to keep me off the drug for another 2 rounds, and I'll get tested again in February to see if I can remain off the drug longer. And now it's been, I feel better today than I have felt in the last 6 years, which is amazing. But I've also learned to take one day at a time, and that's been important to me. You know, sometimes family especially like to plan things ahead, and my answer is I can't plan that far ahead. Let's just talk about what we're going to do now and next week and next month. I changed my perspective, and this is kind of frightening for me personally, because there's no way I could get this message to people. But cancer really changes the way you look at the world, and you look at problems, and you look at relationships. And you can't explain that to someone unless they too were diagnosed with cancer. You could try, to say, well, don't sweat the small stuff, using a cliche, right? But it just doesn't work that way. But for me, yeah, I'm more emotionally open. This interview is a good example, by the way. I probably never would have done something like this prior to my diagnosis. I take one day at a time and plan and try to look forward to the next positive activity. I get very, very frightened right before my next CAT scan because I don't know what the results are going to be. And I literally shut down waiting for those results to come in, and then celebrate big time when the results come in, and they've been indicating that my disease has not progressed. One of the things that I tried to do that I've been unsuccessful about actually is I also look at big events and look forward to them and try to say, well, those events are the most important ones, and therefore I got to fight to be at that event. But actually it has the exact opposite effect until the event gets close or actually occurs. So as an example, my daughter's wedding. When she was getting married, I was convinced that I was not going to be able to make the wedding. So I planned not to be there. I went ahead and prepared a father's speech. I recorded the speech. My request was that it be played at the wedding. But as I got closer, I realized that I would be there. And it's kind of a funny sensation is that when you're anticipating an event that you really want to be at, is when I get most frightened that maybe I won't make it. But then when I make it, it gives me a jolt of energy, a jolt of positive thinking to move forward. So that I said, you know what, I did make it, and I'm still here, and I feel good. And now I can move on to the next chapter of my life. And during this process, I continue to try to find different ways to think and remain positive. And it's been working so far, and I'm going to stick with the plan. You're also surrounded with a lot of people who are also depressed. Family and friends, calling you up and say, I'm sorry to hear about your news. And that makes it even more difficult to get out of that depression state. But you have to work to get out of it. And quite frankly, sometimes people don't understand, at least in my case, didn't understand what I was trying to do for myself to get out of that phase. So if I ask somebody to not ask me how I feel, as an example, they feel that there's a disconnect that you don't want to share with them. But the reality is that it's not that I don't want to share with them, it's that I don't want to focus on the negative. My wife, as an example, wanted to join me at my chemo treatments. But it was more important for me not to have her there and not to have her be upset watching me go through that, and to be able to come home and push through the symptoms that are associated with the chemo effects. And I'd rather they get a hug than a tear associated with the whole process. Yeah. And I'm not quite sure how you communicate to people to work on getting out of the depression stage and even the denial and the anger stage, you know. How to get out of that quickly, accept your situation, and then focus on it. So now I have a problem. What am I going to do to solve it? And what can I do for myself? And what do I need my support group to do for me, right? Other than feel sorry for me. During this process, you know, you get these funny things about what people say to you if you have cancer. And some of these things sort of set you back. They make you feel sorry for yourself. Mm-hmm. So I started to compose a list of things that you should never say to a cancer patient. Okay, and one of them is, you look good. Yeah. Okay, so what does that mean, you look good? Well, it really means you look good considering your situation. So my response to that when somebody says it, and somebody says it to me all the time, is, wow, you look pretty good yourself too. Mm. To move away from the fact that they're recognizing that they expected me to look like I was dying, and they're surprised to see that I look somewhat healthy. There are other things that people do and say to you just because you have cancer. So they find out you have cancer, and they say, "Oh yeah, you know, my uncle had cancer too, and he just died." You know, it's just the worst thing to say to somebody who is trying to not join that club, mm-hmm. right? But they do it, and it's their natural response on dealing with the fact that they know somebody with the disease. Yeah. Quite frankly, I prefer what I call cancer humor rather than discussion like that. If somebody's going to make a joke about it, I'm going to laugh at it. And sometimes that happens, and I'll make my own jokes about the fact that, you know, I'm off chemo now and I got hair growing on my body for the first time in 6 years, and I feel like I'm going through puberty again. Mm-hmm. So for me, laughter is also a big part of this thing. Negativity comes in many forms, right? When I was first diagnosed, and the doctor said to me, you know, you might have up to 2 years to live. My first reaction was, oh my God, you know, it could be even 6 months, it could be 2 years. We'll see how the medication works. My first thought was, he had no right to say that, actually, because he doesn't know, and I'm still here. You know, in my opinion, it bordered on malpractice for him to try to play God in the process of giving me my diagnosis. Mm-hmm. If he wanted to share statistics with me, that's fine. I was able to do that myself anyway and go online and see what the options are, what the prognoses could be. But I think, you know, even from a doctor's perspective, they would provide better treatment if they said, we have these drugs that are designed to help you beat this thing. And as a matter of fact, new drugs are being developed all the time. But instead the message was, you know, we'll see, this doesn't look good, it's inoperable. The entire diagnosis was negative, and partially because probably the doctor that did this was desensitized and insensitive, as a matter of fact. Yeah, I think that, you know, the mind is pretty powerful, and some people might do it just with my techniques, trying to focus on positive things. I think prayer is another example of positive thinking. Even if you're not religious, you're doing the same thing, right? You're hoping and wishing for a positive outcome. The amazing thing is that I'm not religious. Of course, I wonder about creation just like the rest of us. Okay, I think that creation or God has given us some great gifts. The ability to reason, the ability to logic, emotions that can go from one extreme to another. And I think that we should use those things to help ourselves. But I know that I had a lot of friends who are very religious, and they repeatedly told me that they would pray for me. And every time they told me they would pray for me, I said the same thing to them. Please don't pray for me. Pray for the doctors and scientists to find a cure, because I don't want to be so greedy to think that I'm the only one that should be cured. But if you pray for the doctors and scientists, you could help millions of people. Chemotherapy probably took about 2 months to make that decision to investigate alternatives.
Yes.
Not only alternatives between different chemos, whether I was going to go on a clinical trial, take some drug that has been tested to look at what the potential side effects were, how they would affect quality of life, because during this whole process, you think about all the time quality versus quantity, you know, and you make that decision constantly. You know, after my chemo treatments, I'm thinking this is not quality. I want to stop chemo. But then as I start to heal a little bit, I'm still here as a result of that, and now I have quantity as well. So of course you look into all alternatives, and I will tell you that everybody has an opinion about them. You know, maybe there is some corruption and even crony capitalism going on in the pharmaceutical market. But if there was a cure, we would all know about it. There is no secret cure. Now that doesn't mean that alternative therapy doesn't help. So surely relaxation activities help. You know, some people may try yoga. Now, surely people find comfort, I know, in prayer. Okay, I've gone for physical therapy and massages that help me relax through the process of my treatments. So those kind of things are okay. But the one thing that I did not want to do is experiment with other things once I knew that whatever formula I had was working for me. You know, it's very difficult to stay productive when chemotherapy treatments take you out of circulation for 2 weeks out of 6 weeks. But those other 4 weeks, it's important to stay productive. I have to be passionate about it now. I don't want to do things any longer that I'm not passionate about. So any job or project or activity that I get involved with, I want to use my head and my heart, right? I want to be able to think and feel productive, and I want the outcome to be helpful to other people as well. And if you could do those two combinations, and by the way, make money doing it at the same time, you win.
Yeah.
And I think I won.